Old-timers in Marin County have known that for over 100 years, the Ross Valley has experienced flooding every 5, 10, or 15 years. On New Year's Day, 2005, the valley was devastated by a flood that struck and surprised many. Ever since that time, an effort has been made to address flood control in the Ross Valley. Supervisor Hal Brown, before he untimely passed away, led an effort to pass a tax and start a process. Now, for over 10 years, millions of dollars have been spent, plans have been drawn, reports made, but very little has been done on the ground. Now, after all this time, frustration has continued to lead to a real political brouhaha in Fairfax, San Anselmo, and Ross that has led the process to come to a halt. Today, to discuss flood control and flooding in the Ross Valley are two people who have spent years working on the project and know it backwards and forwards, but they've come to a different conclusion. With me today is San Anselmo Council member Tom McInerney. And also with me today is Ross Valley flood control member, or past flood control member, Ross Asselstein. Ross, Tom, welcome to IJ Forum.
Thank you.
2005, New Year's Day, wasn't that long ago, really. We all remember it. Where were you, Tom?
Unfortunately, I was at my house, Dick. I live in a neighborhood in San Anselmo that was really devastated by the flooding. Not only my street, but all the adjoining streets, as well as our downtown. We were there with our kids. My wife and I carried our kids out of our house, which was devastated, as were all of our neighbors. And so we were right in the heart and soul of it. And I'll say there were a lot of negative things that came out of it, certainly, but one good thing was our community really rallied. We had parents from our kids' school, neighbors that all kind of came together and helped us and helped all of our neighbors. But that is a day and an evening I'll never forget, Dick.
Ross, were you in town that day?
Yes, I was. We slept through quite the storm, and we did not hear the civil defense siren, but our house is not in the floodplain. In the morning, we went downtown, saw the devastation, and talked to neighbors that were affected. And we spent the following 2 to 3 weeks helping those neighbors both clean up their houses and at times do demolition to help remove sheetrock and get ready to repair.
Yeah. After the flooding, how did you get involved in the process?
I saw an invitation to apply to be on the San Anselmo Flood Committee and applied in 2010. My background is managing very, very large construction development projects with a great range of professionals and doing problem solving. So I thought I could contribute to the process.
And Tom, how about you? How did you get involved? You were not on the council at the time.
Correct, yeah. I had been involved in my kids' school and some other community activities. What I saw in the aftermath of that was what I felt was a real lack of leadership from a number of our leaders in the community, certainly not Hal Brown, but others. For many years, San Anselmo and Ross refused to even participate in a organized effort with our adjoining communities to address the issues of flooding, and I felt that was a big mistake. We had a number of former council members for various reasons who just refused to, and they felt it was for local control and the like. So I got involved at that point and joined a commission in our town, later ran in 2009 for the town council. This, as well as a number of issues, were kind of key issues for me, and I just felt that you can't sit on the sideline, take pot shots at people. You got to roll up your sleeves and get involved, and that's what I've tried to do with a number of other people.
You know, I can remember right after the flood talking to Hal Brown, who was a supervisor, a longtime supervisor from the Ross Valley, and a very popular figure. And Hal was determined to do something, but the first thing they did was the tax to raise money. Before they had a plan, they really, as you recall, decided they had to come up with money to pass a tax, and that tax became very controversial. Mainly because the way it was conducted. It wasn't a public vote tax, it was a property owner tax. It passed, but did that start things off on the wrong foot?
Possibly, but I'll add a couple of points. One is, it was, the election you're talking about was done under Prop 218, a state ballot initiative, which, you know, I think it generated initially, because it's sort of, for a lot of people in the Ross Valley, it was an unusual election. These elections are handled throughout the state. It was done completely legally as as our California Supreme Court eventually ruled unanimously in a lawsuit brought by one of my colleagues, Ford Green. So everything was done completely consistently with the law. I think where there was sort of a failing initially was at the outset of an explanation, a clear explanation to the public about the process. And so it helped generate some of the naysayers, some of these folks I mentioned who don't want to participate or get involved in these issues, to really cast a lot of doubt on it, which I think were very unfounded, but it sort of got things off on the wrong foot.
What do you think, Ross?
I think the legal side of the ballot has been settled, but it is still emotional for some people. I think that what I look at the heart of the problem is that, as I understand it, there was a phone interview of people in the, or survey of people in the Ross Valley to say how much, this is preceding this ballot, how much would they be willing to spend in terms of a fee? And as you said before, they put the vote together before they found out what it was going to cost. Mm. So that's a way to win an election or win the ballot, but not a way to set the bar and align expectations with the reality. And what's happened, I think, is, and it's absolutely critical, is we set a fee based on that's an acceptable amount of money, not whether or not that fixes floods. And that's a huge error, and that continues to be a huge problem in the valley, because there's now a great expectation that we're going to fix floods for $150 a parcel.
A fundamental question, maybe a preliminary question almost. Is it a soluble problem? Is flooding in the Ross Valley a soluble problem? There's some people that would take the old-time European approach is, well, you live in a valley, floods happen, that's the way history is. Americans tend to take a different approach that we can solve every problem. I mean, is it soluble?
With infinite money and compromises in the valley, yes, it's solvable. Engineering is one thing, and reality of making it happen is a different thing.
Why?
Because the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA have recognized the difference between flood mitigation and flood risk management. We've spent $8 or $10 million chasing a flood management process when it's insurmountable to actually completely fix the floods. And what we should be doing is looking at a wider range of policies that look at risk mitigation. And it has become very obvious that we don't have enough money to fix floods. And I think our leaders need to continually communicate that. And I think we've had a bit of a King Lear moment in that we've found out that we are, a big part of what we spent time doing, educating people, to say we're going to run out of money and we are not going to fix the floods.
Tom, soluble or not soluble?
I wasn't clear whether Ross thinks it's solvable. I think it clearly is. I mean, and you don't have to look very far, Dick. And you can look just at adjoining counties: Napa, Sonoma, Santa Clara County, Contra Costa County, Alameda County. A number of our adjoining counties have all had major flood issues, as well as Southern California, the Central Valley, and the like, and they've successfully addressed it. It has to be done. There aren't easy solutions to it. They're sometimes fairly complex, but they're definitely solvable. And you just have to look at anyone who's been to downtown Napa. Napa used to be, the downtown used to be really a dying area because no businesses could really stay in business because the downtown flooded every several years. But now you go to downtown and it's a booming area. It's growing because they were able to address it through a combination of not only engineering projects, but other projects that were less, visible to address that problem. And, we can all throw in the towel, raise the white flag and say, gee, it just floods every several years and it's going to continue to. I just reject that out of hand.
I'm familiar with the Napa thing. I spent a lot of time as a young person up in that area. And the Napa folks have touted that they used a green solution, an environmentally sensitive solution to flood control, which is a nice sounding term. What did it mean in Napa?
Well, I think, frankly, in Napa, because we've looked very closely at it, I did a tour last year of a detention basin that they have near downtown Napa. There's one in Sonoma County. Napa was, as I indicated, I think a combination of projects. So they did some engineering projects with the river, with the Napa River that addressed it, including replacing bridges and the like, so increasing capacity. But they also have a detention basin that's actually right near downtown that holds water during peak rainstorms, and they've done other things like that. So I think probably when you've heard that, the green solution is oftentimes things that have been able to, hold water as opposed to building flood walls and large construction projects. So as I said, Napa, I think, has done a combination of that, as has Sonoma. Santa Clara County, Santa Clara Water District has done a number of projects down near San Jose that have also addressed these problems using this kind of combination of different projects.
Ross, the old line in government is don't ever invent the wheel, reinvent the wheel. Look for somebody else who solved it. Are there other areas that you would suggest? Napa was just mentioned by Tom, but any other areas that you can think of that have, in your opinion, addressed the problem, flooding, in a way that's both doable, affordable, and environmentally sensitive?
I think if we look at that question globally or across the U.S., the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers have figured out that it's almost impossible to solve 100-year floods in most major areas. In our little valley with steep walled sides and 9 inches of rain in a few days and a very short amount of time, it's an incredible challenge. And what I've seen in the 6 years I've been involved in observing and reading about this is that we've gone wildly over budget, and because reality is slowly setting in, there's a conscious effort and stated effort to not update costs for things. So there's a story here about trying to fix floods that is evolving, and we watch the costs go up for this project every year. And what's happening is a very expensive education, and the difference between trying to mitigate floods and mitigate the risk. And if you look at things in the Central Valley, permits now require you to, if you're going to build a new structure, you have to be above the floodplain, the same as we do now in San Anselmo and other areas. But FEMA, when they started insuring things, and they started to put together insurance policies for these things, or an insurance pool, they said, look, you have to get out of the way. You have to get out of the way of nature sometimes. And there's entire towns that have been moved in North Dakota because people couldn't fix, the Red River.
Should we do that in San Anselmo? I
think that if we want to not experience the kind of losses that we've had in prior years, which is about every 20, 25 years, there's a quote-unquote 100-year flood. We have to get out of the way.
100 years.
The statistics on this are messy, but the reality is we know some 60, 70 years of detailed flow history and 100 and something years of actual, anecdotal history, or not anecdotal, but documented history of what was in the streets.
Raise San Anselmo, move it. Are these practical solutions? And cost-wise, Tom raises a good point. Costs can get out of control, and I know this process has spent a fortune on studies. Yeah. So what's the response?
Well, no, it's completely impractical to say we're going to just raise the whole town or move it. These are private properties. The fact of the matter is decisions were made decades ago, 100 years ago, to develop the valley, and it is what it is now. And we have to address it based on the reality of where things are today. We've done a number of things from planning requiring low impact development and other things in our town that can address kind of at the margins, but to address these major flood events, we're going to have to do a lot more.
Well, Tom and Ross, we're going to just take a little break and come back in just a second to go on and talk and try to solve the problem of Ross Valley flooding.
Thanks.
Thank you for watching our show. I'm Robert Sterling, editor of the Marin Independent Journal, and I want to invite you to go to our website, marinij.com, or you'll find information about flood control in the Ross Valley. Just go to the story about this show. Thank you for watching our program. I hope you enjoy it.
We're talking about flooding in the Ross Valley. San Anselmo Councilman Tom McInerney is with me, and former San Anselmo Flood Control Committee member Ross Aselstein is with me today to address this issue and see if we can come up with any solutions or any way to approach the problem. And gentlemen, the problem is kind of bogged down. It's been 10 years since the big flood of 2005. When I was a councilman, Tom, we had a city manager in Mill Valley named Doug Dawson. And after a big disaster, Dawson said, if you don't address the problem within 6 months to the year, your window is closed. The public tends to forget the disaster. The process gets bogged down in politics and details, and nothing happens. Could that be the situation here in the Ross Valley? Might it be necessary for us to wait until the next flood and then take the 6 months to a year window to do something?
Well, I hope not, Dick. You know, I've talked to you before, Doug Dawson. I know he's a great city manager. We were faced with an issue initially. Fort Greene sued to block the program for about 3 years, so that was unavoidable. So the program screeched to a halt with that. I hope it doesn't come to that we have to wait for another flood. There are a number of things that are continuing to happen. They may not get the media attention, but the program is still continuing. For example, I was just in the IJ the other day. As part of the program, we've implemented various things that have reduced, both in San Anselmo as well as the unincorporated areas, flood insurance rates for everyone who has flood insurance by implementing what's known as the CRS program. We have all the planning that's continuing with our bridge replacements. We're going to be replacing 3 bridges in San Anselmo, which would help with capacity. And there's also one in Fairfax as well as Ross that are continuing with planning. So there are things happening. Clearly, some of the major projects, because of efforts to kind of defeat or stop the program, as well as just going through the normal permitting and CEQA process, are happening much slower than any of us would like. So that's part of what you're seeing, I think, on some of the major projects.
Russ, you were talking before about the difference between flood control and flood mitigation.
Yeah.
Let's go to flood mitigation.
Okay.
What do you envision as a proper and prudent method to do flood mitigation if you can't do flood control?
I think there's aspects of both which are going to come into play in the final solution. And that is, but I don't believe we're going to mitigate floods of 100-year events. We have a limited amount of fee money, and yes, I understand that we've spent a lot of money, but I don't think it's all wasted. With things like Phoenix Lake is moving forward, certainly dredging is going to move forward. All the rebuilding of the bridges is important. Purchase of properties to realign streets to put bridges in better positions. All those are good things, and those are part of flood mitigation. But what we're doing in that process is mitigating smaller floods. We're reducing the flow or holding it back. But we're going to run out of money. So we have to seriously look, before we run out of money, is look at adding flood risk mitigation to this. Our town hall, our library, our police station, and our fire station all have floodgates. And they have floodgates because they work. And they worked on the properties that had them in place during the flood in 2005 and 6. Our commercial district is going to flood because I believe we're going to run out of money to build a 100-year fix. So therefore, what you do quickly in the near term, and I stood up 2 years ago and said, why don't we spend money to figure out a way to get floodgates on all the commercial properties? I also believe that the frustrations people have with living in a floodplain and having bought a house in the floodplain is that it's an expensive proposition, and I think there's a question of public policy. How do we show empathy to help do what's written in the fee language, which is to help people that live in the floodplain?
Seems one of the problems inherent is that when San Anselmo, what we know of downtown San Anselmo today, what we know as downtown San Anselmo today, is really built often on a creek.
Yeah.
Some of it's over a creek. I used to go to the old Gunnings hobby store.
Sure.
Remember that was?
Yes, I do.
And after the flood, I went in and talked to the fellow and said, how'd you do? He says, well, as well as can be expected. I said, did you have the gates, and did that do any good? He said, I came here that night when the flood was going on.
Yeah.
You won't believe this, he says, the floods came up through the floors.
Yeah.
And you know the location
yes,
where
yes,
it is.
I do.
So floodgate wouldn't have done him any good.
There's a more comprehensive solution to trying to fix that.
Yeah, but you kind of grapple, oh my God, what do you do when it's so pervasive?
But we all appreciate there's a difference between the emotion related to that loss and the reality of whether or not we can fix it. So I don't believe we're going to fix 100-year floods. And I think if we had honest answers on what things are cost, we would find that, we would see that, because we're going to run out of money. We have to look at other policies of which actually help people. Tom was able to raise his house, other people weren't. So that was a smart move. He mitigated the risk. He didn't try to fix the floods, and he did that 10 years ago. We need proactive things as a part of this suite of tools that are available, not just one review of how we're going to, you know, fix nature.
One thing
I just want to add that it's not just the San Anselmo issue downtown. I'm sympathetic to what happens in Ross and Fairfax. I mean, all those downtowns are in exactly the same position. You cannot move the town like they did in North Dakota, but you really need a fix that's short term that mitigates the hazards.
I hear you saying, tell me if I'm wrong, flood control is possible, but fabulously expensive.
Absolutely.
And that the problem is we can't afford to do it, therefore we have to do flood mitigation.
Therefore, we have to look at both issues simultaneously.
Is it too expensive, Tom, to do true flood control that will really protect downtown Fairfax, San Anselmo, and Ross?
Well, okay, we can debate the terminology. There is, I mean, as I mentioned, flood control, whatever you call it, flood control, flood mitigation, that has been very successful throughout the Bay Area. No one has ever said that the flood fee that was passed was enough to pay for everything. It was always anticipated that it would, the whole program, if we were to get to the 100-year flood level, it was going to take a long time, require grant money and other funding. It was basically seed money to adopt this. I do think that we need to identify, and I think we are on that process, we're in that process, to identify the key things that will help with the largest amount of ways to lower the flood risk for our whole community. As you indicated, you know, floodgates and things like that are just Band-Aids. You know, Ross brings up raising my house. Yes, I was able to raise it. We had the resources to do it, but that would be why I think the suggestion is we should raise every house in the Ross Valley or that gets flooded. That's like ridiculous. That would be, you know, probably $1 billion to do, and these are private properties. You can't require people to do it, especially if they don't have the resources to do it. There are methods we can do to significantly reduce the risk. They go beyond just throwing up your hands, waving the white flag, or saying let's put little Band-Aids on the things. On projects. There are things such as detention basins and the like that can be really useful.
Detention basins. Big issue in San Anselmo, now big issue in Fairfax. I have to say I'm confused about some of the opposition to detention basins. And Ross, I'm going to ask you about this because I think you have some knowledge about it. Sure. I appreciate that building a detention basin is going to take some excavation and moving of trucks and inconvenience. That's obviously. But they are, as you say, once every 100-year floods, I'd say every 20-year floods, practically speaking, but they're not often. And when the detention basin is used, it's generally going to be used for a couple of weeks. The water is then dissipated in a fashion. Am I right about that, first of all? Is that an accurate observation? It may be inaccurate.
I think there's a nuance to that, and that is that the flood events every 20 years is one way to describe it is that's when you would need the detention basin, right. But when you would actually use it is a different question. And in discussions with the county engineers 4 or 5 years ago, the question was asked, how often would you use the basins? Yeah. And between the desire to use them and the ability to judge what's actually happening with a storm and to decide when you're going to close gates, the answer from the the county engineer was similar to my own intuition, and that was we'd probably operate these about every 4 or 5 years. Okay. This also, if you look at what's happening in the flooding in the Ross Valley, there's 2 types of events: the 20-year monster floods, and there's very frequent floods in neighborhoods like Morningside, where they get floods about every 5 years. So I think we're going to see an evolution of the detention basin stories, which brings the frequency of use to them to be much more frequently. It's going to be in the 3 to 5 year range.
Tom, there is legitimately a concern about detention basins. The last election was all about detention basins. It always seemed to me that I blame it more on the county, but the county had dropped the ball in explaining to folks really what was entailed here. No pictures. We had no idea, so you don't know what it's going to look like. I presume the worst case scenario. I mean, it's just human nature. I still don't know what they would look like. How come?
I think that's a very valid point. I think part of the issue, and not to justify it, but the nature of the process is that we, even though the critics would say that this was all top down and we're ramming this down the throat of people, there was actually no actual design that had been developed with community input. So when you have naysayers, mostly around the park, who would use the most extreme example, they're going to be 18-foot concrete walls and the like, the response could only really be, no, we don't anticipate that, but we haven't designed it yet. And so, but I think there can be better methods for, for explaining it and getting input from the public. One thing I'll say on detention basins, during the 2005 flood, the creek was so high, there was, I think the estimate is 7,000 cubic feet of water going through the creek per second. So this is a massive amount of water, and there are only limited things that can actually be done to address that flood control. Floodgates and the like won't do it. You need to either increase capacity, make the creek wider, and which can help, but it's only going to bring the water further downstream. The other thing you can do is to hold the water so it doesn't all go into the creek. There are no other real methods, and these are proven successful throughout the Bay Area, throughout other states. And so if residents in some neighborhood don't want to have it in their neighborhood, then we're going to have to find other areas. There are really no other explanations or ways to address this problem.
The process, to both you folks, it seems to have stopped. We had this pivotal election in San Anselmo. There's very strong feelings. All the communities up and down the creek are polarized. What would it take, briefly, to get the process back together where a consensus can be built and something can be done to help these folks when floods do hit? What can we do to rejuggle the process to get people to work together?
I think I share Tom's prior comment is the process hasn't stopped. I think Measure D's success was a huge crescendo and a defining moment in the process, because people became more educated of actually what is in play, and that is that the current benchmark for what we might spend is only going to fix a 20-year, 5-year flood, not fix 100. Memorial Park specifically only had a reduction of flooding in San Anselmo that was, in the public's view, not worth in terms of process.
Yeah.
Again, I'll come back to it, and that we have to look at hazard mitigation has to have a very strong component of this immediately. I think that's where it's going.
Tom, what can we do to get the process back briefly?
A couple of quick things. I think we need
Restart it.
Yeah, I think we need people of goodwill on both sides to come together to address and to work together to adopt mutually agreeable solutions. Right now it's polarized. We have people who want to kill the program, and we need to bring people of goodwill together.
Well, that's our effort here to do. You guys both have very interesting comments. It's a quandary, a dilemma, if you will, but dilemmas are soluble. It's good to have Councilman Tom McInerney with us.
Thanks.
And Ross Esselstyn, it's good to have you as well with us. Welcome to IJ Forums, both of you guys. And folks, stay tuned. Next week we'll have more.